Alrighty, we can hopefully. I'm unmuted. Alrighty, so we can shut that off. Hello, hello, hello. This is part dos. I don't know how to say part in Spanish. Part dos of my review of. I almost said Stephen Halper. Jesus Christ. Phil Halper and Stephen Meyer's discussion on God, cosmology, and fine tuning. This was on Justin Brierly's channel, Think Faith. I'm not going to link it just because it's not going to be hard to find. I mean, you can see what you can see. So which means you can type. If you can't type, I don't know why you're on the internet. This is so the first section that I did last Friday was on primarily the Kalam cosmological argument for all intents and purposes, beginning of the universe. What does the physics say? What is the philosophical argumentation? I didn't really touch that much on that stuff. But the second part will be on fine tuning. I'm not going to keep you guys waiting any longer. I don't want to wait any longer. Again, I have watched this whole video, so I have an idea of what's coming. And I do want to reiterate some points I made on Friday before we start here. Number one, I think this was a phenomenal discussion. I think a lot of points were touched on with regards to specifically, first cause cosmological arguments, as well as fine-tuning arguments and how these arguments relate to God and the scientific data and what the relevant scientists say. I think Phil did a phenomenal job of defending his position and defending what a lot of the position that a lot of atheists, I think, more generally are going to take. But as I said on Friday, I also think Stephen Meyer is a lot more formidable than he's given credit for, at least in this area. I don't know enough about the biology stuff to really comment on that. There's other people that might say, oh, Stephen Meyer is completely incompetent when it comes to the biology stuff, and that's probably true. But at least with respect to the topics of the discussion that these two had, I do think Stephen is more formidable than a lot of people are going to give him credit for. You can take away from that what you will. Anyway, let's finish this up, shall we?
Let's talk about our next big issue. This is the second big sort of scientific discovery that you talk about in Return of the God hypothesis, Steve. And it's the fine-tuning of the universe for life, this idea that it appears that there are a certain number of cosmological sort of factors, values, laws, numbers that are precisely dialed to the values they need to be in order for life to appear in the cosmos. Sketch out the big picture here and why it, for you, lends evidence to the idea.
Right. Well, the idea of fine tuning is that there are a number of parameters that fall within very narrow ranges, outside of which life and even stable galaxies and even basic chemistry would be impossible. And the existence of those extremely finely tuned parameters and their importance for there being a life-friendly universe provides evidence of a fine-tuner. And this is the idea in the theistic argument is that we have a lot of ordinary experience. Our uniform and repeated experience, which is the basis of all scientific reasoning, shows that when we see finely tuned systems, invariably they are the product of a mind, whether we're talking about a friend.
I think that depends on what one means by fine-tuning. And this is a point that I've made a lot. There's been some people that disagree with it, but I still think I'm correct. That there is a difference between what fine-tuning means when a physicist says fine-tuning and what fine-tuning means when an apologist or usually a theistic philosopher says it. So, firstly, when physicists talk about fine-tuning, what they're referring to is that in our physical theories, we have certain parameters that we have to input very precise values for. Otherwise, those theories just don't work right. We aren't sure why we have to put such precise values into these parameters to get them to work. It could be because the theory is incomplete and we don't yet have a deeper explanation for why it's these precise values. It might be some brute fact of the theory that's the value that goes there. But I don't think this is what apologists tend to mean when they talk about fine tuning. I think they're generally referring something more to this idea that life was an intended goal of some creator. And so this creator set up the universe such that life could exist within it. That is not what physicists mean. So I do think that there is some confusion when people say, oh, but all the major physicists accept that there's fine tuning, depending on what you mean by fine tuning. And so I think even if one granted fine tuning, that does not imply that there must be some sort of mind or intelligence or intention, agency, what have you, behind that fine tuning.
Recipe or an internal combustion engine, or the way in which a piece of software runs a piece of hardware, that type of fine tuning where there's a vast ensemble of possibilities, only very few of which will yield a propitious outcome. Those are systems which invariably are the products of mind. And so when we see that feature of a vast ensemble of possibilities, only very few of which will yield a life-friendly universe, it is a natural conclusion based on our ordinary experience of cause and effect to infer that there was a designing intelligence. Thus, for example, Sir Fred Hoyle, who was one of the first scientists to
one point I always like to ask when I hear these apologists say, oh, well, but like the values have to be so precise rather, in order for there to be life. I mean, they're so delicate for life to exist. I always say, well, why should we center this on life? Don't you think those values or their ranges would change if we went from life to, say, stars? There's probably more ways that you can get stars, or a greater range of these parameters over which you could get stars than you could get specifically life, or maybe protons or something like that. Why life? Why center it all on the probability of specifically life? And the question is a serious question, but there's also a sense in which, not really facetiousness, but it's more that I'm trying to get the apologists to admit that they're like sort of, I'm not going to say arbitrarily, but I think it's somewhat of a contrivance is the word I'll use for them to center the whole thing on life. And I think it sort of plays to some underlying biases that might be factoring into their analysis. Why should I consider whether or not the universe is fine-tuned for life rather than for protons or black holes or stars or the hydrogen or something like that? Why life? I mean, I don't think life has any sort of intrinsic value or worth. And the word intrinsic there is doing a lot of work over anything else in the universe. So I'm not convinced that we should be concerned with whether or not life is what we get out of it. I don't think that matters.
Discover some of the fundamental fine-tuning parameters, those related to the formation of carbon in the universe, said that a common sense interpretation of the data suggests that a super intellect has monkeyed with physics, and this
and blind chance is not something worth speaking of. I mean, give us an example of one of these apart from Fred Hoyle.
We've been talking in a cosmological context. We have an expanding universe. Outward, I argue from a beginning that expansion is fine-tuned, and accepted value is about 1 part in 10 to the 90th power.
So if it differed from that value by one
thing that's always kind of bothered me about a lot of the scary big numbers argument that you often get here is how are these values derived exactly? And I'm not denying that there might be some way that these values are derived, but I would kind of like to see the sort of the probability calculus on that, because we always hear about these big numbers, but we never hear how those big numbers got derived. So I think that that's an important factor there.
1 part in 10 to the 90, we'd
either get a heat death or we get a big crunch.
Okay. So something that's inhospitable to the possibility of life.
And another thing to say about the fine-tuning is there are different classes of fine-tuning evidence. Okay, there's the fine-tuning of the strength of the fundamental forces measured by their constants. I won't go, I explain what the constants of physics are in the book, but
Yes, I am muted. Thank you for letting me know that. I don't recall muting my mic. Give me a second here. Strange things happen. Anyway, this is the point that Stephen brought up here is really interesting, because as it concerns what used to be referred to as coupling constants for the fundamental interactions, they're not actually constant. That's why most physicists today refer to them as coupling strengths. And the strength of the coupling can be written as a function of the energy scale, where for, say, electromagnetism, I believe it is that the strength of the interaction increases with energy scale. And for quantum chromodynamics, for the strong nuclear force, you often hear it, strong interactions, it decreases. And I believe this is why at high enough energy scales, you actually can get unbound quarks where you can just see a quark. In our everyday experience, quarks can only be observed in bound states. So you're either going to have a quark-anti-quark pair, or you're going to have 3. There's some other exotic forms where you can get, I think, 5 quarks bound together. Hadrons, as they're called, particles comprised of quarks, and there's baryons, which are going to be like 3 quark systems, 5 quark systems, the proton and the neutron are baryons because each is constructed of 3 quarks. And then there's mesons, or quark-anti-quark pairs. And you only ever observe a quark in a bound state unless you're at high enough energy levels, because the strength of the interaction weakens such that asymptotic freedom, I believe, is broken. And in this state, you usually get what I believe is called a quark-gluon plasma, where you can actually have quarks in an unbound state. So the strengths of the fundamental interactions are actually not constant. The terms that physicists use, they run with the energy scale. And this is so well understood that physicists have a term for it. They call it running of the coupling, or you might often hear, I think, effective coupling is another way. And it just means that the coupling constants are not actually constant. They change with the energy scale.
So there's the fine-tuning of the laws and constants of physics, but there's also the fine-tuning of the initial conditions of the universe, the configuration of mass energy at the Big Bang going forward.
Considering that we don't know if this is like any sort of true beginning to the universe, there could easily be states that tell us why we see the conditions that we do in the very, very early universe.
And both, there are multiple parameters, but there are at least 2 different categories or types of fine-tuning. And some of the different models that have been proposed to explain the fine-tuning will explain one class but not the other, or the other and not the one. And so that's another thing to keep in mind.
Okay, and so for you, this again is part of an overall case for why God.
It's a sign of intelligence.
It's a sign of intelligence.
We find when we find finely tuned systems, we can look around the room, find any number of them.
And see, what Stephen is doing here is effectively confirming the thing that I said earlier a few minutes ago about defining what fine-tuning means. Is that when he's saying, "Oh, we see things fine-tuned all the time," what he means is, "Oh, we see things designed with some intention by an agent," because that's what they mean by fine-tuning. Designed. There is some intended goal of the system, and the system is designed to reach that goal by some agent who has the intention. Mind you, that's not what physicists mean by fine-tuning.
We should apply the same reasoning to
we should apply the same
universe.
reasoning and realize that there's mind behind it.
And I have to say, Phil, this, even among many of the atheist sort of thinkers I've spoken to, Richard Dawkins, Peter Millikan, others, they've often said, actually, if there's one argument that has given me pause for thought, the fine-tuning of the universe is pretty remarkable.
Well, I mean, look, all of the standard arguments for the existence of God can be not the greatest, but there still be some that are a little bit better than others. And yeah, I think most philosophers would probably say that teleological arguments are some of the better ones, as are contingency arguments. Those are two that are usually cited as some of the better attempts at arguing for God's existence, but there are still perfectly reasonable and powerful objections to those arguments. So acknowledging that there might be a tier or a hierarchy to arguments for the existence of God doesn't necessarily mean that you're convinced or that anyone ought to be convinced by any of those arguments.
Now, do you in any way sort of question the fact of fine-tuning, even if you perhaps are going to...
And again, I want to clarify this point because I don't want it to be missed. The fact of fine-tuning is the fact that we have to input very precise values into the parameters of our physical theories, and we don't at least currently know why we have to do that, and there may never be a why we have to do that. That's just the way that it is. The fact is not that life was intended as a goal by some agent who designed the universe so that life could exist within it.
Go in a different direction in terms of explaining that fine-tuning.
Well, I think it's better for me to reveal not what I think, but what physicists think, because I've done some surveys with physicists about what they think. So how about we do that?
Yeah, let's find out.
Okay, so I've done 2 surveys. One was at a conference in Copenhagen, organized by the Niels Bohr Institute, had leading physicists there. And so that was, very, very high, top names in the field, but a smaller sample size. So I think we had about 80 replies. We've then teamed up with the American Physical Society, and we've done what I think is the largest survey of physicists ever. I think it's about roughly 1,700 replies we've got. So why don't I reveal what the results are?
Okay, you've come prepared.
I've come prepared. Yeah. So this is what physicists actually think. So let's start with the Copenhagen survey, which we've actually published now. The other one has not been published yet, but I hope by the time this goes out, it will be. Okay, so we gave them various options to explain the fine-tuning, and I'm going to go from the bottom up. Okay, and one thing to put this in perspective is just consider how many scientists believe in God. Okay, so there have been a lot of surveys done in the US because that's where we have data, so that's what I'm going to quote. For the general population, it varies survey to survey, but it's something like 70 to 85% believe in God. For scientists as a whole, again, it varies a bit, so it's something between 30 and 40%. So it's a big drop. And then when you go to what are called the eminent scientists, the top people in the field, they surveyed, let's say, members of the National Academy of Science. They got, I think, 7% believed in God. So another big drop. Okay, so here are the results from our Copenhagen survey. The least popular option by the scientists was selected as the intelligent design option. It got 3% support. Now notice that's much, much lower than even the numbers that believe in God from the other survey, right? It's less than half. So that got 3%. The next one was necessity. So this is the idea that the constants are just have to be what they are.
Right.
So there's no point arguing about, how improbable they are, that there's some mathematical reason why they have to be what they are.
Yeah, there are a lot of people, maybe I shouldn't say a lot, but there's I would say a decent amount of people, at least from what I've read in like philosophy of physics, who do actually hold to the idea that the fundamental laws and the fundamental constants and all of that are just what they are. It's in the technical jargon, it's nomically or nomologically necessary. That just means physically necessary according to the laws of physics, the way that the physical world is. So that is actually a view that is held by a measurable amount of people in the philosophy of physics, is that the fundamental constants and parameters and the fundamental laws are just nomically necessary. That's the way they have to be. Now, I want to just clarify, though I think all of you were smart enough to figure this out, that this is different from logical necessity. It's not saying that they're logically necessitated, but that they're physically or nomically necessitated.
I don't know what it is.
And how many took that?
So that got 9%. Okay. The next was a Darwinian selection.
Okay.
So that got 10%. So the idea here is we've seen this problem before. If you throw genes together randomly, you're not going to get a functional organism. And I think most scientists think that Darwin solved that problem. Now, obviously, Stephen doesn't think so. So this one's not going to be popular with him. But the idea is
kind
that
of Darwinian on a more sort of
the idea is that the universe can reproduce itself.
I see.
Okay, so one way that's like, for example, Lee Smolin come up with a particular mechanism, but you could imagine other mechanisms. But the idea in Smolin's model is that a black hole could give birth to a new universe. So if singularities are replaced by bounces, which seems to be implied by some models,
which is taking us back to our previous conversation, but there's some explanation in the evolution of the universe in previous states that allow that we find ourselves in one that is.
Yeah, it selects for ones that can reproduce themselves. So it's selecting for more black holes, not for life. Life just becomes a sort of happy byproduct.
Okay.
So that's Darwinian selection. So that got 10%. Okay. So number two, I've admitted here no opinion and other. Okay. Number two. You want to guess what number two was?
A multiverse?
Yes.
Okay.
Multiverse was number two. Okay, so that got 24%.
And just again, just for the sake of those who perhaps don't know what we're talking about in that regard, could you perhaps briefly explain the multiverse hypothesis?
Yeah, so we actually say it's anthropic selection in the multiverse. So multiverse is that it's like, imagine the lottery, right? Super unlikely that someone wins the lottery unless lots of lottery tickets are sold. If lots of lottery tickets are sold, quite likely that someone wins the lottery. And then the anthropic selection comes in, whereby, so the idea is you could only observe the universe that has life-emitting values. So there's a selection bias. It's not what's the most likely universe. Our universe could be incredibly unlikely. It's what's the most likely universe to be observed, because you have to observe the one that's life-emitting. So that's why we call it anthropic selection in a multiverse, right?
So that was the second most popular sort of way of making sense of fine-tuning of the universe for life.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. Yeah.
And what was the number one then?
Any guess?
I don't know.
Go on.
Okay. It's that the constant nature are brute facts that need no further explanation. That there's nothing to be explained.
And that's
here.
different to them being necessary.
Yeah. No, so necessary is different to a brute fact.
Okay.
So necessary means they have to be what they are. So imagine like a coin flip, right? So you could take a coin flip and say, okay, it could land heads or tails. It landed heads.
By the way, the idea that the fundamental laws of reality, well, I'm not even sure if laws are like things in the world, but if it is in the physical laws, but if they are, then I would just take that they're brutally contingent features of the world. I don't think the laws are real. I think that reality has certain fundamental symmetries, patterns, and regularities, and I think that at least at the fundamental level, those are just brutally contingent. That is just the way the world is, and there isn't anything left to appeal to without utilizing your imagination in highly creative and not very well supported ways to appeal to in order to account for that. You can't. If it's the fundamental level, then that's the fundamental level. There is no more level further down the chain, so to speak, to which you could appeal to explain what you think is the fundamental level and everything above it, or to do any sort of accounting for that. Because if there were, then that would just be the fundamental level. And then you might ask, well, what explains that? And if you found something, then that would be the fundamental level. So either it goes on forever, which almost nobody thinks, or it terminates in something necessary or something brutally contingent. Now, what kind of necessity that is, what possesses the necessity can be debated, but I prefer brute contingency. That is literally just the way that it is. And that's all. And it's not that you're dodging an explanation. It's not that you can't give an explanation. It's that there isn't one there to be had. Carl Sagan, I think, words it wonderfully. The universe just is, and that's all.
It's a grand metaphysical explanation. There isn't none. Just deal with it. It landed heads.
Okay.
Who cares, right? It's heads. That's what it came out
as. Brute fact.
And so it's just a brute fact. It's not that it had to come out heads, whereas necessity means it has to come out heads.
Okay.
Right? There's some reason why it had to come out heads. Right? So that was our survey of the experts.
Interesting.
Then when we did the American Physical Society, that's much broader, much broader. We had 1,700 replies, and so the results are pretty similar. Okay, they're not radically different. So intelligent design, I expected to be. I thought, well, look, the population of elite scientists, let's say 7% believing in God, and the broader scientific community is maybe 35% believing, so I thought it would go up by 5, but it only went up by 3. It was 9% belief in intelligent design. Okay, so it was number 2 from the bottom rather than number 1 from the bottom, none rather than at the bottom. Okay, then necessity actually was the one that got the biggest boost. Okay, now we actually rephrased it. I should because when we spoke to the American Physical Society, we went, necessity is a philosophical term, so we rephrased it to there's a principle that sort of forbids fine-tuning.
Yeah, the laws are producing their own fine-tuning parameters.
Yeah. Well, it's that there's some reason why
the contingent features of the laws, whether it be their initial conditions.
Well, we don't say that. It's more that there's a reason why they have to take on the values that they do from coming from physics.
Okay.
Right. So that got 19%. So that got the biggest difference between the professionals and the broader one. Then Darwinian selection had 6% rather than 10%, and multiverse went down a little bit, 24% to 21%. And yet again, brute facts was up on top.
Okay, interesting.
Now, here's one of the important things.
I can't remember if Phil mentions this. He might mention this, so if he does, I'm sorry for saying what he's going to say. But so what you can see is that there's 2 surveys that he did. One that was amongst like a specific subset of professionals that was still one of the largest polls done amongst that subset of professionals out there. And then a much broader one that much more broadly polled the general experts in that field. And the idea that like the term that I like to use, again, I don't really consider it technical language, but I'm autistic, so my language is a little bit more precise. What I would refer to as the gnomic structure of reality, you just really the fundamental physical structure of the world, the laws, the constants, the parameters at the fundamental level, what they are. I would argue, so first off, the idea that the gnomic structure of reality is brutally contingent is the most popular position amongst the experts, as Phil has just demonstrated for us. But if you go look at the 2020 Phil survey and you survey just all respondents, it's also the most popular. If you survey philosophers of the physical sciences, it's the most popular. And if you survey general philosophers of science, it's also the most popular. And I also think it's the most popular when you look at just specifically epistemologists. So more broadly amongst philosophers as well, the idea that fine-tuning is as they worded it in the Phil paper survey, or the fundamental structure of reality, the idea that is brutally contingent is not just the most preferred response, the most preferred idea amongst the relevant scientists, but it is amongst relevant philosophers as well. Like, this is far and away the most preferred view. Now, that doesn't mean that the view must be correct. And I'm not arguing that means that the view must be correct. But I think that it's certainly a point in favor of that view, that amongst the relevant physicists and philosophers who have examined these kinds of questions, that they have reached at least a plurality, if not a consensus, on a particular position. I think that lends credence to the view.
Thing I want to take away from this, okay? Because we're often told that you have to choose between an intelligent designer or a multiverse, okay? And this is what physics is telling us, okay? But if you actually ask physicists what they think that neither of these 2 options is well, if you add up those 2 in both surveys, they came to less than a third.
Right.
Less than a third back that option, right? And so actually physicists don't think you need to appeal to intelligent designer or a multiverse, not by a majority. I mean, some do, obviously, right? So this is important because the narrative that we're being told is that these are your 2 choices. And in fact, many physicists think that's not correct.
Okay. I'd just be interested in your response to this interesting survey that
Sure.
was done.
I think it's an argument from authority, and it's an argument ad populum.
I keep muting myself. I don't recall hitting this button. Whatever. So I think it's a bit disingenuous here for Stephen to accuse Phil of committing these fallacies. Phil didn't really give an argument here at all. On top of that, he didn't argue that any of the positions was correct because scientists told to it. He never said anything like that. He didn't say, well, the multiverse. All he said is, look, here's what the scientists have to say, the relevant physicists have to say about this question. So the idea that it has to be an intelligent designer, or that's the most parsimonious or the most popular option, is just not the case. But he never said anything about which option is correct or incorrect. So he didn't argue from authority to the truth of some proposition, and he didn't appeal to popularity to the truth of some proposition. So he didn't commit either of those fallacies. All he did is just say, hey, here, look, here's what physicists say about this. Here's some of the positions they hold to. Here's the amount at which they hold to these positions. And lo and behold, intelligent design is at the bottom.
Okay, we're going to take a vote, right? Nothing in what was said responded to the basic logic of the fine-tuning argument, which is that when we find fine-tuning as a feature of systems and we know how they arose, they invariably arose from the activity of an intelligent mind. So we could identify...
Make sure I'm not muted. If by fine-tuning you mean some sort of goal, intention, something like that, which, again, it's not what the physicists mean.
To see if the consensus view of the scientists that there's nothing there to be explained, whether they would apply that reasoning to any other fine-tuned system that we might see in, say, our terrestrial environment. If a section of software had to be very finely tuned to produce a certain programming output, would we...
And see, this is, I remember this, not muted. I remembered this part of this debate where Stephen starts appealing to all these things. But at this point, all he's doing is just equivocating on the term fine-tuning, because when we talk about fine-tuning a software, that's not what fine-tuning means in the sense that physicists understand it. So that just seems like he's sort of jumping between a bunch of different meanings of the word fine-tuning, and I just think that's equivocation on the term.
Say, well, the software is just a brute fact of the system, or would we want instead to attribute it to a programmer? Similarly, if we saw that there were a whole lot of ways of arranging the parts of an internal combustion engine, but only very few of those configured just right will result in the engine working, would we want to say there's nothing there to explain? I think if we're going to appeal to the consensus of a community, we also need to be aware of what the assumptions of the community are about how they are to practice.
The problem there is that when it comes to things like engines and software and stuff, we already have a massive set of priors about those things that inform us in ways where we'll seek explanations for them. And we already know what the explanation is because we know that humans did those things. The same cannot be said of the fundamental layer of reality. Whatever the fundamental structure of the world is, we don't have the same priors about that being designed or being intended or created by an agent or something like that, like we do with engines or software. So just not an apt analogy, in my opinion.
It's their discipline. And this applies to both materialist and theistic scientists. And that is that there's been a long-standing convention in science from about the late 19th century, soon after the Darwinian Revolution, that science must limit itself to materialistic explanations only. It has a fancy name. It's called the principle of methodological naturalism. I think it's very much at work in the proliferation of naturalistic pre-Big Bang models, all the things we were talking about. But many scientists have been quite open and honest about the role of this convention in
so science not considering super spiritual, paranormal, or otherwise supernatural things isn't like science saying we're going to adopt a principle that limits our ability, like those things are out there, but we're going to do science specifically so we don't have to talk about those or something like that, which kind of seems to be that might be a bit facetious, but I still think that that's kind of this idea that Stephen is trying to paint here, is that, well, the scientists just want to adopt all these assumptions that make it so science can't discover the obvious truth of God or something like that. No, it's in the fundamental methodological nature of science that it can't measure and talk about those things because of what science is and how science carries forward. Science is strictly empirical. I mean, some might say, well, but there's a theoretical aspect to science, but that is fundamentally rooted in a variety of empirical observations and methodologies. That's what science is. That's what science does. And the thing is, the minute that somebody says, oh, yeah, but the supernatural or what have you could be empirical, it could be at least in principle understood by science, then my question is, okay, if it's understandable by science, then what separates it ontologically from everything else that science understands, such that it's supernatural or non-physical or whatever word you want to use, rather than natural or physical? And this is part of the problem I have with the notion of the supernatural. I just think it's ill-defined. I think it has to be defined as beyond the capabilities of empirical investigation, because the minute you can empirically investigate it, what separates it ontologically from all of the other stuff that we can empirically investigate that is natural?
Affecting their own thinking about the God question. For example, Richard Lewontin, the really famous Harvard evolutionary biologist, was quoted several years ago as saying, we take the side of science. He's talking about the historic conflict between science and religion. He said, we take the side of science in spite of its many counterintuitive constructs, inside of its unsubstantiated just so stories. Think the multiverse, for example, because we have a
Well, the multiverse isn't going to be a just so story, because it's directly theoretically motivated. So that doesn't follow.
Higher commitment to material.
Just for those that are curious, it is directly motivated by something like inflationary cosmology, and there are other cosmological models that directly motivate a multiverse. I think ekpyrotic cosmology, which they touched on briefly in the part 1, which you should go watch if you haven't, after this, of course. But yeah, that's motivated theoretically by models that we have. It's not just a just so story. It's not like they're just ad hoc saying, oh, well, it could be like a multiverse or something to avoid objections or something like that. It's, oh, these models that we have directly motivate a multiverse.
Materialism. And he said that commitment is absolute. We cannot allow a divine foot in the door. So you have something like the fine-tuning evidence, which, as I've argued in the previous session, occurs repeatedly in attempts to model the universe without a beginning. So you've got this very fundamental feature of reality that we recurringly encounter. And rather than saying something needs to be explained, or we say nothing needs to be explained, or we come up with a multiverse theory. And yes, intelligent design is at the bottom of the heap, but it's at the bottom of the heap among a community of people who accept that it is their duty as scientists to limit themselves to strictly materialistic explanations only. So I don't think we can assess the rationality of the fine-tuning argument by an appeal to the consensus of the community.
And in a sense, I'm also hearing here that good scientists don't always make good philosophers of science. There may be some extra.
They absolutely, yeah.
Well, you know, what's funny is most philosophers of science also take the same view that the scientists in Phil's survey did. So philosophers of science are not going to agree with you at any higher rates than the scientists do.
Yeah, they absolutely do not.
And that's because they understand that science isn't limiting itself. There's a particular way that science works. There are things that fall within that purview and things that don't. And unfortunately, intelligent design does not. That's just the way that it is. If you don't like that, then make your models rigorous and empirically investigable. And if we can confirm them, then quite frankly, they'll probably just be incorporated into the naturalistic picture. I don't see why they wouldn't be.
And so just polling is, so what do you find?
But notice when you poll philosophers,
yeah,
brute facts was the number one.
Okay, well,
view
that's
there.
interesting. as well.
So you can't appeal
Okay.
to philosophical ignorance. No, hang on.
It's
Wait a minute.
appeal.
Wait a minute.
You're
wait a minute,
appealing
Stephen.
to a consensus.
No. I'm not. Okay, because I'm not saying you have to believe in brute facts because that's most popular. I'm not saying that. But what I'm trying to do is to correct the narrative. Because, of course, notice that when Stephen opened his argument up, he appealed to Fred Hoyle as a great physicist. No question he was.
He was also the discoverer of the first set of fine-tuning
Please don't interrupt. I didn't interrupt you, right? Okay, right. So people appeal to the authorities when defending the fine-tuning argument. And I think it's worthwhile pointing out what physicists actually think. I certainly don't think any scientific disagreement can be decided by a poll. Obviously not. Right. But what we can do is say, look, people are saying this is what physicists think, and they're misrepresenting.
So here we have a multiverse, brute fact, and then there's actually there's more than that think that it's a multiverse. There's more that think there's no fine tuning than there is to think it's a multiverse even. So. And you can see design, and this is just amongst the general philosophers. This is just all respondents on the Phil paper survey. So we're going to go back to this. Play this a little more
because they haven't actually done the research, and we have. Right?
Well, I'd push back on that. At the back of Luke Barnes's wonderful book written with his atheistic supervisor from Cambridge. He did his PhD at Cambridge in physics. He has a list of all the leading physicists who accept that fine-tuning is something that needs to be explained. And so that first explanation is that it's just a brute fact. Maybe many don't. But the fact of fine-tuning is something that's on the table. It's been established by leading physicists.
Fine-tuning, as I defined it, has been established, not the ways it seems that Stephen is using it. And now to show you this is the same survey. I have specified specifically philosophers of physical science. So this is gonna be like philosophers of physics and stuff like that. And yeah, design 9.52%, brute fact 35.71. And again, there's more that think there's no fine tuning that think that it's multiverse even. So again, not saying anything about what view is correct, just corroborating what Phil outlined and showing that, yeah, there is a plurality amongst both the relevant philosophers and the relevant scientists with respect to cosmological fine-tuning towards brute fact. That's just the way that it is. So that should settle that.
But it hasn't been established. This is something that's been disputed. This is the whole point.
All right, well, let's go there.
What we're trying to do here is that this has been disputed. Right.
So you're questioning the very.
Are you questioning the fact of fine-tuning, or that there's a need for an explanation of fine-tuning?
Well, it depends what you mean by the fact of fine-tuning. So
now, outside of the way that physicists use fine-tuning, I myself would say there is no fine-tuning. The reality is not fine-tuned for anything. My view is that reality is not fine-tuned. Our physical theories are fine-tuned for the reasons that I've outlined, because we have to input certain values, very precise values, for the parameters of those theories, for the theories to work. And at that point, then it's obvious who fine-tuned them. We did. They're our theories. Fine-tuning is a feature of the physical theories, not of a feature of the world itself.
So don't forget that when physicists use the term fine-tuning, they don't always mean the definition that Stephen often gives, which is that it's improbable to have life-limiting values. A lot of the time, physicists use the term fine-tuning. They mean something else. They mean that a theory needs some parameter.
Also, so let me get a drink of water because I'm about to make a big point here. Air bubble. So a point that I want to make here, and I've made this to other theists that argue two positions simultaneously. Stephen Meyer wants to say that the fundamental constants and parameters of the world are such that if they varied by even extraordinarily small amounts, you would no longer have life. Life would no longer be permitted to exist within physical reality. He wants to appeal to the fine-tuning. But then he also wants to say that you can't get the natural world, the same one that's fine-tuned for life, cannot produce life of its own devices. It requires some special input, some divine input. He's an intelligent design proponent. We all know Stephen Meyer's opinions on abiogenesis. So the reality that is so precisely finely tuned for life, if left to its own devices, could never produce it? What sense does it make then to say that reality is finely tuned for a thing it can't ever make by itself? Now, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that these two positions are logically contradictory or anything like that, but I certainly think that there is an inconsistency in arguing from fine-tuning while at the same time maintaining a view of, about the world where life cannot arise via natural means alone. So there's certainly some contention between holding both of those positions. Again, I'm not going to say there's any sort of contradictions, at least logically or something, but there's certainly some contention between the both of them. And it's something I've pressed Otangelo, who I'm sure many of you know, on this, and he didn't have a response to this. There's one other person who I can't remember off the top of my head that I questioned on this, and they didn't have anything to say. I'd be curious to know how Stephen would respond to what I just said. How can you hold those two positions? The universe is so fine-tuned for life that it couldn't produce it. So God needed to fine-tune the universe for life and then turn around and make life in the universe because it can't do it on its own, even though he fine-tuned it for it. Like it just doesn't make sense to me.
To have some unlikely value, for example. And so people question, what do you mean by unlikely, right? So the problem is that when we talk about probabilities have to come from somewhere, okay? So where do these probabilities come from? So a lot of people would say, you can't do probabilities for things like this because you don't know the mechanisms whereby they are set. So if you take an example, let's say you throw a die, okay? You can say, oh, 6 is just as likely as 1. It's just as likely as 2.
Yeah. It's a 1 in 6 probability.
I could say probability of getting 6 is 1 in 6. How can I say that? What justifies that? Well, I know how many sides the dice have. Okay, I know that it's equally weighted. Okay, I know how many times I get to throw, because if I get to throw more times, then different outcomes can be possible. I know how many dice there are. So think of the constant nature. Do we know how many sides there are on the dice? No, we don't. Right? We don't know.
I'm sorry if I'm distracting you. How do you guys like this little bubble here? Does it work? Does it work, or should I go back to the? Should I go back to this? The square. I don't like the square. The square doesn't look right. What about a little bubble down here? Huh? You guys dig it?
Know how many values are actually possible, right? So some people would challenge. You're assuming they could take on different values. Maybe they can't. Maybe there's some principle that puts them in one value rather than another. Or more broadly, we can just say we don't know how many sides are on the dice, nor do we know if they're equally weighted, nor do we know how many dice we have. So, for example, if I have one die, I can use something called the principle of indifference. I can say each side of the die is equally likely. So if 6 comes up more often than 1 or more often than 2, something weird is going on. I'm justified in saying that, right? Because I have experience of dice and I understand how dice work, right? Now, for the constant nature, we don't have that. Now, and in fact, if you throw in another die, actually the principle of indifference that you use, give each possible outcome the same weight, actually doesn't work anymore. Because in fact, 1 is now impossible if you have 2 die. You can't roll a 1 if you have 2 die. And in fact, 6 becomes much more likely than 2. Right, so that principle of indifference that you were using before, which is what's being used in the fine tuning or something like it.
I think I get the general idea though, that you're taking objection to Steve's idea that the specificity
it's a hard word to pronounce, isn't it? I keep listening
of these numbers is improbable because you don't know what the conditions could have been. Otherwise, you don't know.
You don't know the mechanism that's generating the probability. So in fact, let me give an example that was used by a good guy called Chris Hitchcock. He's a professor.
I think one way you could word it, at least if you're like a Bayesian, is just to say that we don't really have, we can't really say we have any any meaningful priors to conditionalize the probabilities upon. So it doesn't really make sense to say like, oh, well, the probability is this or that. But the probability given what precisely? Like what priors? And people have attempted to give some set of priors, and they're not hard to disagree with. So, and I don't think that I believe, at least perhaps maybe in some like highly niche situations, there's such things as objective priors, but I think otherwise that there just aren't.
Philosophy of physics, editor of the Oxford Handbook of philosophy of probability. Sorry, and he gives this example of a jar with beans in it. So you've got lentils and red beans, and you could say, look, a priori. So if I've got these red lentils and black beans, what if I shake them up? What's the probability that all the black beans will go to the top? Well, let's say I give them 1/2 probability because it could go to the bottom or the top, and there's 100 of them, and you get this extraordinary low probability. Then he shakes the jar up, and all the red lentils go to the bottom. Right? What's going on? Well, you understand the process. There's a force of gravity pulling them down, and the smaller ones go through the cracks in the bigger ones. So what you calculated a priori was this fantastically low probability, and it's got absolutely nothing to do with the real world because you didn't know the mechanism,
some of the other mechanisms
that would lead you. So if you don't know anything about dice, right? So suppose I'm just going to have a random number generator go between, let's say, 2 and 12. You might say, well, a priori, 6 is no more likely than 2. But when you learn something about how dice work, you find out, oh, actually, 6 is more likely than 2.
We're not justified, essentially, in saying this is improbable when we don't know what mechanism produced the values of the universe.
Right, and the appeal in the example is to some sort of underlying law, in this case, the effect of gravity on the things in the jar, right? But the interesting feature about the basic parameters, the constants of nature, is that they are contingent features of the fundamental laws themselves, of the 4 fundamental force laws. And so there's no, because they are features of those.
I feel like it's probably more accurate to say that the fundamental interactions are given by symmetries than it is to say that they're given by laws. Yeah, you could probably say there are something like physical laws involved, but I think that what the forces, the fundamental interactions in nature really are, they're the result of symmetries. We know this so well. We've developed forms of mathematics. We didn't really develop it for this in every instance, but we have forms of mathematics that exquisitely capture a lot of that picture. And for me, I would just say again that, well, the symmetries are just brutally contingent features of the world. That is just the way the world is. There is nothing that you could appeal to, since you're talking about the fundamental level. There is nothing more that you could appeal to in providing an explanation of those symmetries,
of those laws. There's nothing more fundamental than those laws to appeal to in giving an explanation for why the values would be set necessarily in one place rather than another. So what might reduce the probability is an appeal to necessity, but I think that is the least plausible explanation for the incredible improbability or the setting of those fine-tuning parameters. If the parameters themselves are features of the laws, you can't refer to the laws as the explanation for the parameters. Well, the argument I thought that Phil might make has to do with the probability, the probability being set if you have an infinite range. Okay, this is the objection that comes up more often. Well, if there's an infinite range of possibilities, then no matter how narrow the number is on the denominator, it's going to be undefined because anything divided by infinity is 0. Okay, that's something called the normalizability problem. It says we can't render meaningful probabilities, but there's been a lot of advances in physics on this issue One is just some work that's been recently done by a Colombian mathematician at the University of Miami, showing that it's actually using non-standard analysis, you can generate meaningful measures of probability, even dealing with infinitesimals. But the other thing, and this is something that Luke Barnes and Robin Collins have shown, is that there are natural ranges that allow us to calculate probabilities, because the ranges are all of discussions of fine-tuning parameters are defined in relation to the standard model of particle physics. And that has both upper and lower limits for most of the key parameters. And so there are not infinite ranges of possible values, but finite ranges. And those natural ranges also help with the question of, well, what if the probabilities are not equiprobable? We do know that there are underlying physical processes that might play a role, but when you get to the fundamental physical processes, there's nothing more fundamental that can determine what the contingent features of those laws actually are. Those contingent features, again, being the constants of physics, which have very idiosyncratic and precise values.
Now, look, we can continue to tease this out, the probability issue, or we can perhaps accept you're not going to come to agreement on whether there is a legitimate sort of probability issue with the fine tuning, but we might at least accept that there's an interesting feature of our universe.
Can we just accept that?
Good thing I'm double checking to make sure I'm not muted. The only interesting question that I would have for Stephen here is what constrains those ranges in the standard model of elementary particles?
There's a debate about this.
And I'm just going to let that one marinate.
It's often presented as if it's a fact. Fine-tuning is the fact of fine-tuning. We often hear this, the fact of fine-tuning, right? Or the discovery of fine-tuning. And what I think we can at least concede, there's a debate about whether you can even talk about the probabilities for a universe if there's only one universe, right? There's at least a debate to be had about this. It is not an established fact.
Well,
yeah, I don't concede that. I think that there's been very good work on this normalizability problem that shows that it is possible to render very meaningful probabilistic measures of the fine-tuning parameters.
Well, I'm going to accept that
we can just agree to disagree.
We're going to agree to disagree there.
And I also do agree that there is a debate,
okay.
but I think
I think there we can find.
I think Stephen is just wrong here.
There's an agreement, right?
There's
a debate to be had.
Let's look at some of those other possibilities. I mean, although it wasn't,
can we talk multiverse?
Well, yeah, I was going to say, although it wasn't the highest on your survey, the solution to the fine tuning that is most frequently given is the concept of the multiverse.
Yeah, the highest on the survey was the non-explanation explanation. The multiverse is the highest as the alternative explanation.
Yeah, the multiverse one assumes that there's something to be explained.
Yes, exactly. Right. Yeah. So, I mean, maybe I could have a go at roughly, explain what this one is.
Give us both a break. Yeah.
Exactly. Look, there is a mechanism. I think inflation is often the one that's given at one level, though there's this kind of string theory version of it as well, that one of that hypothetically could allow for the creation of many universes. And if all of these, potentially infinite number of universes all have a different set of variables or constants, and then yes, your lottery analogy, although it's very improbable that any single one will be the winning ticket, there will be more than likely one among all those. And we happen to be in one of those unusual universes.
That is a pretty good way to put it. Everybody, and it's kind of intuitive too. The probability that any one person will win the lottery, I think it's somewhere around roughly 1 in 300 million. It might be, a little bit off of that one way or the other. But I want to say the odds of any one person winning the lottery are like roughly 1 in 300 million. But the odds of the lottery being won by somebody are probably much, much, much higher. So again, a lot of this has to do with how you're structuring the probability and what priors you're conditionalizing the probability on, at least from a Bayesian perspective.
That does give rise to life because it happens to have been sort of spawned with just the right numbers to allow for it to happen. This is the multiverse hypothesis. Why don't we start with you, Phil, on this one, giving us what you understand to be some of the best evidence that this could be a valid interpretation of the fine tuning of the universe that doesn't necessarily have to invoke God.
What I don't believe in any of these explanations. Like I think
you said
it's a
that you're
mystery,
agnostic
right?
on these.
So I think there's a mystery. Okay. It's not even clear there's a problem to be solved, but there might be, right? There's a debate about that. Right. Oh, okay. Now, my broader view is that whatever theory we come up with, I think it would be really good if it had predictions that can be confirmed. Okay. Now, I think necessity arguably has some potential predictions. And that is that the constant nature, well, if they're necessary, they couldn't take on different values, right? So we should never observe them taking on different values. And indeed, that's exactly what we see. Now, that's weak evidence because, in the high energy physics, it could be different. So it's not brilliant evidence, but it's some evidence, right? The Darwinian selection, that's in some sense a multiverse, but it's not anthropic selection in a multiverse, okay? So again, is there some evidence for that, again, in terms of predictions? Again, very weak, very circumstantial, but there's a quantum gravity theory called causal set theory, and causal set theory seems to be a sort of, there's been some work sort of connecting causal set theory to this Darwinian model, okay? And causal set theory predicted that the cosmological constant would have the value that it does. And it did that 10 years before it was observed. So that gives it a boost. Far from certain, this is very much work in progress, very tentative, but it's better than nothing, okay? Now, coming on to the anthropic selection in the multiverse, one of the reasons why I don't believe causal set theory, because, hey, it did make this prediction of in fact, in causal set theory, it's not a cosmological constant. It should vary over time, but it had the value that we observed. Now, another theory that predicted the cosmological constant before it was observed was the multiverse. So Steven Weinberg basically assumed there's something like a multiverse, and he said, well, now it's important to point out what we mean when we say the cosmological constant is fine-tuned. What did you say, 90?
10 to the 90th is the figure I get from a variety of physicists.
Yeah, it varies.
Some high, 10 to the 120,
go up to 10 to the 120, in fact. It depends on what assumptions you have. So people aren't sure about exactly what number to put on it. What that doesn't mean is that you couldn't vary it at the 90th decimal place. That's not what it means, okay? You could actually vary it a fair bit. I think you could put the cosmological constant up by like 100 times or something like that, and nothing bad would happen. In fact, you can make it half the time smaller, nothing bad would happen. You can make it 1 billion times smaller, nothing bad would happen. You can make it 0. Most people thought it was 0, nothing bad would happen, right? The 120 comes from the prediction from quantum field theory. So quantum field theory seems to be saying the vacuum should have this enormous energy. It should be 120 orders of magnitude. So what physicists thought, would there be some sort of cancellation principle, some symmetry principle that would cancel out the contributions, the positive contributions to the vacuum, and they would cancel out to 0, okay? And Weinberg said, you know what, maybe there's no such principle, okay? Maybe there's just a variation. And so what would happen is we should observe a value that's compatible with our life. So it wouldn't be 0, but it would be small. It would be some small value for the cosmological constant. And again, he predicted it 10 years beforehand. Again, I don't think this is convincing because there's a lot of subtleties about this prediction. And so it's far from convincing, but at least you could say it's not nothing. There was a prediction of the value before it was observed. Okay. Similarly, inflation, at least now, again, in our book, we talk about inflation. There's a lot of claims and counterclaims. But if I was going to put my inflation hat on and argue for the multiverse, I want to be really clear.
Inflationary Phil.
Right. I want to be clear. I think there's good arguments for and against, but given the context of this question, I'm going to go with the for it. Okay. You can at least make the claim that it made predictions for experiments before they were done, and they were confirmed by experiment. Now, again, there's controversy about that, but that is actually broad consensus in the cosmological community. So, in fact, if you look at NASA's WMAP, ESA's Planck, they say we have good evidence for inflation. Now, I interviewed George Efstathiou, who was the cosmologist at Cambridge. I don't know if you know George.
I don't.
But he was the scientist chosen to present the European Space Agency's Planck spacecraft CMB data release. Okay. And I asked him, what can you say about inflation? Because I think there's really strong evidence for inflation, and it favors models of inflation that produce a multiverse. So I think Planck has shown evidence for a multiverse. Now, I'm not saying he's right. Okay, I think there's plenty of counters.
There's an argument out there.
There's an argument out there that at least it looks better than the God one, because I don't think God has any claim to predictions for features of the cosmic microwave background. There's no argument for that.
It's
Agreed. I don't think God really. I mean, I think that perhaps somebody could structure their idea of a God existing and it makes some sort of predictions, but like for instance, if you hold the classical theism, I would say a prediction of that is that there should be no evil in the world, and well.
Tentative explanation.
So it's a tentative hypothesis,
but it's better in principle than saying
it's had more success.
I'm going to run to the bathroom quick, folks. I won't be too long. I'm obviously going to let the video play. I don't hold to a multiverse. That's not the explanation I would use. So I don't have a whole hell of a lot to say here. And I think Phil's probably going to touch on a lot of points. There might be certain clarifications or what have you that I want to give, but I will be right back.
So far, there's plenty of reasons to doubt it, and I'm not saying inflation is right.
We accept all those caveats. Yeah. But in the end, whichever one you're going for, necessity, multiverse, brute fact, it sounds like from where you're standing, all of those feel like better candidates at this point than a creative intelligence beyond the cosmos who
I would
set things up so that all of those constants.
And there's plenty of problems. Right. Even if you set the multiverse aside, maybe we'll get a chance to go with thinking there was an intelligent designer behind it.
Well, that's where we do need to get.
So we do get to that. Even if you set all this multiverse discussion aside.
So let's talk about multiverse.
Yeah, maybe we'll just get it out of the back and forth here. I'll just give you my take on it. Okay, all right. First of all, we have got a little bit of a difference in the level of explanation here. What you would expect from a God hypothesis or from a transcendent intelligence would be evidence of fine-tuning. We wouldn't expect to generate fine-grained predictions about cosmic
microwave background,
cosmic microwave background radiation, CMBR. Okay, so an empirical expectation of a theistic design model would be fine-tuning, and that we find it provides confirmation of that. Provided that it provides a better explanation than alternatives. Now, the main alternative is the multiverse as an explanation.
I'm a little bit confused what he means by like empirical predictions of the God hypothesis, because does the God hypothesis have empirical content? God is not an empirical agent. And nobody has, in my opinion, thus far defined how God empirically interacts with the world. So I'm not sure that the God hypothesis has any such empirical content that it could provide for empirical predictions. That just seems mistaken to me.
Explanation, not as a non-explanation explanation. And it happens, as I mentioned, that there are two different kinds of fine-tuning. There's the fine-tuning of the initial conditions of the universe, and there's the fine-tuning of the laws and constants of the universe. And in order to explain both types of fine-tuning, multiverse advocates have proposed conjoining two different cosmological models. Now, there's a reason for that. If you have a lot of different universes out there and they're causally disconnected from one another, then anything that happens in one universe is not going to affect what happens in another universe by definition, including whatever process it was that set the fine-tuning parameters or what gave them their improbable values. And so for a multiverse hypothesis to work, there has to be something like an underlying common cause, a universe generating mechanism. So you can portray.
Yeah, like inflation.
The different universes as the outcome of a kind of giant lottery. And indeed, multiverse proponents have formulated two such models. One is the inflationary cosmology, and the other is a string theoretic cosmology. And it happens that the multiverse cosmology does a nice job, if true, of explaining the fine-tuning of the initial conditions of the universe, but because every bubble universe within the inflationary cosmological model that is created when you get just the right inflaton shutoff energies, since they're all governed by the same laws, then you don't get a shuffling of laws and constants. Conversely, for reasons that are much too difficult to explain, but which I do address in the book, string theory could do, in principle, a decent job of explaining the different laws and constants of physics, but not the initial conditions. So in virtue of that, the most current multiverse models conjoin those two things and give us a inflationary string or string inflationary model, okay? Now, that ends up illustrating one of the points I've been making, which is that these speculative cosmological models end up having real big problems with Occam's razor. And I want to be able to explain that first and then explain what is the even more difficult problem.
Okay, we'll let you do that and then we'll have Phil respond.
The first problem is you get this multiplication of theoretical entities.
And just before he goes on his spiel here, to remind those that don't remember or maybe didn't watch the first part of this, which you should after this, multiplying your theoretical entities isn't like a death knell for a theory. If you have two competing hypotheses, let's just say X and Y, and Y has more assumptions than X, but Y also explains more than X and better fits with the data than X and has a more well-established precedent than X, then you should go with Y, even though X is technically simpler in the sense that it's more parsimonious, it contains less assumptions. This goes to the whole theoretical virtues thing. Parsimony is a theoretical virtue, but it isn't the be-all end-all of theoretical virtues. And there can be models that are more parsimonious than others, but lack the explanatory power or the explanatory scope or the established precedent, that don't fit as well with the data. You could have a simpler model, but it doesn't have any other theoretical virtue. You wouldn't prefer that model. So you need to consider all of the theoretical virtues with respect to some model in determining what models you should accept as more likely.
String multiverse, the inflationary string multiverse, to explain the fine-tuning.
And to add to that, one thing about the God hypothesis is that it has no established empirical precedent. It doesn't fit with the data. I think that its explanatory power is lax. I think its explanatory scope is so broad that I don't know how we define its explanatory scope. And for the most part, I don't think it's simpler either.
As well as, call it commonsensical inference to design, you have to posit an inflaton field. You have to posit the idea that the shutoff energies in the inflaton field will produce new universes. You have to posit that those shutoff energies will happen in just the right measure at just the right time within a narrow interval. Then you inherit all of the theoretical entities involved in string theory. That the fundamental units of matter are small filaments.
The thing is with the God hypothesis, first off, you have to assume there's a God. Then you have to assume that it wants to create a universe. Then you have to assume that it wants to create a universe that looks like ours. Like you could do this same thing with theism.
It's called strings, that there are multiple dimensions of unobservable dimensions of space beyond the three that we observe. There's 6 or 7, depending on whether you accept M theory or not. And you have to accept that there are things that wrap around the strings that determine laws and constants. In the book, I list what I call 10 impossible things you have to believe before breakfast. The multiplication of theoretical entities in this combo multiverse hypothesis is pretty profligate. You get what philosophers of science call bloated ontology. And so when you compare...
Well, no, it wouldn't be bloated ontology, because all of the things listed there, an inflaton field and all of this other stuff that he wanted to mention, various parameters in these would all be natural things, which again is going to be simpler than the God hypothesis in virtue of the fact that we don't have to posit any other ontological entities outside of the ones all of us can agree exist, i.e. natural things, natural entities. So this is nothing to do with ontology, positing all of this stuff.
The theistic,
At least not in the sense of positing anything more than the ontology that is already supposed, that being the natural world.
design hypothesis with the inflation.
All you would be doing is just positing that there's more to the natural world than what we currently understand, which I would argue is just almost certainly true.
Inflationary string multiverse, you've got one simple postulate which aligns with our ordinary experience of cause and effect, which is that minds generate finely tuned systems.
But when minds, and I think Phil, I think he brings this up. When minds generate complex systems, they do so through natural means and in accordance with natural laws. We don't have any precedent or intuition or whatever you might want to say for well, number one, for the very concept of disembodied minds, and number two, that they can engage in causal relations with the physical world, that they can cause things at all,
versus an explanatory framework that requires a multiplication of very abstract theoretical postulates, and which in fact have to be conjoined. So you've got two different theoretical models that you have to accept working in tandem. That's one problem.
Sorry, that's quite a lot. Can we get a chance to reply?
You got to filibuster.
Because that's a lot there. There's like three different arguments.
You keep accusing me of interrupting you, but you get to filibuster and I don't.
I do want to give Steve the chance, because he obviously feels it's important just to lay out a whole case.
I have a full case.
Maybe I can borrow your pen and write this down, because honestly, there's quite a few different arguments there.
Go for it.
Okay.
All right. The second thing is that in each of these speculative cosmological models that are conjoined and postulated to explain the fine-tuning, each of these require universe-generating mechanisms that themselves have to be finely tuned. And so they take you back right to where we started, which is unexplained fine-tuning. So I'm actually...
Again, fine-tuning as the physicist means it, and just like we do in the first instance, one can just appeal to brute contingency.
Sympathetic to what Phil said. Maybe there is a multiverse. I don't know. But the existence of a multiverse would not refute the design argument. Rather, it would underscore it at a different level. And that the multiverse advocates can't explain fine-tuning without invoking prior fine-tuning. For example, in the inflationary model, the inflaton shutoff energies have to be extremely finely tuned, and the interval in which they occur has to be extremely finely tuned. In string theory, there's a whole lot of implicit fine-tuning, a little more difficult to explain because string theory is just very much more difficult to explain. But you've got this unexplained fine-tuning in both models, suggesting even if the multiverse is true, you still need intelligent design.
Okay, so those are the two, possibly three different things.
I think it's got like six.
Okay, so there's quite a few different things there.
Well, two basic critiques: that it's bloated ontology, violating Occam's razor.
Yeah.
Not a simpler explanation than theistic design, and not an adequate explanation because there's no ultimate explanation for fine-tuning within the multiverse framework.
Yeah, and that requires further fine-tuning in order to justify itself. Okay, where do you want to begin?
Okay, I don't know. Okay, so first off, Stephen said that you need an inflaton field. Not true. It's generally modeled as having an inflaton field, true, but it's not true that you have to have it. There are versions of inflation.
Fair enough, but
no, but this is important because the whole point is, you have to fine-tune the parameters of the inflaton field. Okay, but there are versions of inflation that don't require. There was a new one published very recently, actually, where you don't even have an inflaton field. There are others that don't require an inflaton field. So maybe what this is telling you is that inflation is incomplete, right? And there are other versions that maybe are better. Okay, so no doubt that inflation is an incomplete theory. I don't doubt that for a second, right? But so what? All right, we progress in science. Okay, so now he says it.
I like that a lot. So what? Yeah, then it is an incomplete idea, and it doesn't have to be an inflaton field. I think there are some other mechanisms that have been proposed that are very much like inflation. But I think the point being that these models are incomplete is important because I think that the reason why we have to input precise values for these parameters isn't because that's just what we have to do, that's just the way that it is, then it's going to be because the theories are incomplete.
Inflation requires fine-tuning. That is cherry-picking the literature, I'm afraid, because there are certainly papers that say that inflation requires fine-tuning, and there are others that say no, inflation is generic. So yes, you can quote the papers that say inflation requires fine-tuning, and lots of people in this game do that, and they forget the papers that say actually inflation would be quite generic. It often depends on what you think happens before inflation. So for example, as I said before, you could have a bouncing cosmology, and in some of those models, the bounce is seen as an alternative to inflation, but in others, you have a bounce and inflation. Okay, and in there, the idea has been claimed that they actually set up the conditions for inflation, and inflation is not fine-tuned, right? So you know, again, there's so much more uncertainty about this. So he says, you know, this requires fine-tuning. That's too quick,
okay.
Right? Okay. Now he talks about string theory, and you need all these assumptions. Okay, I personally think that you don't really need this, right? Because I think the advocate of the fine-tuning argument has to presume that the constants could be different. So if you look at, like, let's say when William Lane Craig presented the fine-tuning argument, he did it as a deductive argument. He said, oh, it's either chance, necessity, or design. How did he rule out necessity? He appealed to the string theory landscape. He said, well, look, in string theory, you've got all these different solutions to how the compactification of the extra dimensions happens, and that gives you different constant nature. So the constant nature are not necessary, right? But if we deny that, if we say, okay, I'm not going to believe in string theory, okay? But now what's the...
You open the possibility of them being necessary.
Exactly.
Right,
Necessity just comes straight back in again, right? So it's the fine-tuning advocate that needs to say that the constants could easily be different. Because if they couldn't easily be different, if you've got lots and lots of universes, like say in the inflationary multiverse, and they all have the same constants, I'm going to say, maybe the constants aren't that unlikely, right? Maybe the necessary guys are right. Right. So I think you don't need any of this string theory stuff. But even if you did, right, again, string theory, it does need assumptions, true. But it also gives you a lot, right? So when we think about what theories are plausible, yes, when they have assumptions, that's a cost against the theory, true. But you have to weigh the cost versus the benefits.
See, this is the difference between being someone like me and someone like Phil. Phil is doing an excellent job here in laying out these models and pointing out how, well, a lot of the things that you're saying they need to assume, they don't actually need to assume. But right now, I would be focusing less on propping up any one model or, you know, talking about the whether these models make these assumptions or need to make these assumptions. And I would be focusing on what broadly the 2 points that Stephen was making there. Number one was bloated ontology, and number one was inadequate explanation, both as compared to theism. And then I would just explain how theism makes at least one more ontological claim than naturalism does, in positing the natural world plus this one other thing, whereas the naturalist just says there's a natural world. And all of these models, string models, inflationary models, they're all strictly natural models. They don't incorporate any non-natural, supernatural things as a part of them. So they're well within the ontology that we all know and agree exists. So there is no bloated ontology. They're not really. They might make assumptions about the natural world and what properties it has or anything, but that's not really bloating the ontology in the sense of adding more ontological assumptions to what you're doing there. And then with respect to the inadequate explanation, I'm not really sure in virtue of what it is that God explains. I think one of the big reasons, I think I said this in the first part, one of the big reasons is, at least with respect to a lot of scientific explanations, I think they're generally what are referred to as contrastive explanations, which is sort of saying that, you know, X explains Y rather than Z, rather than like X explains Z. You know, you might say X explains Z, explains YZ rather than Y. But if God can be used to explain pretty much anything, which he often seems to be employed to do, then I just don't know. And I say that because suppose that string theory was true. Stephen Meyer would still probably believe in God. Suppose inflationary theory is true. Stephen Meyer would probably still believe in God. Suppose the universe was really eternal into the past. Stephen Meyer would probably still believe in God. Suppose that life could form naturally. Suppose that evolution was true. Stephen Meyer would probably still believe in God. So it seems that God is consistent with any way the world could have been. At least when we're considering just this general theism. So it doesn't seem that there's really any contrasting there to be done, such that God provides for any sort of meaningful explanation of why things are the way that they are rather than some other way. Why is the universe finely tuned for life rather than not? You need to make a bunch of assumptions about God. Why did he set up the initial conditions the way that he did rather than some other way? I don't think it can provide a good explanation for those. I think it fails as a contrastive explanation for anything. And for that reason, I don't think it's a very good explanation, particularly when trying to account for a variety of empirical facts. And so I think that if we're going to consider explanatory adequacy, I think it's clear that theism lacks explanatory adequacy, particularly as compared to naturalism.
And string theory does a lot, right?
And just to tack on to the end of that, I'm not entirely sure that naturalism really explains things, at least in the sense that most people are using that term, rather than just being a broader metaphysical thesis in which explanations might be nested or something like that.
It gives you finite solutions. It gives you a unified theory of all forces. It gives you quantum gravity. Holography came out of string theory. So you have to try and weigh up the costs versus the benefits. Now, a very important point. Stephen says that God is a simple hypothesis because it just assumes one thing, God. Right? That is, I think, a totally wrong way to think about the cost of assumptions. You don't measure the cost of assumptions by just how many assumptions you have to make. You have to weigh them by their plausibility. So let's think of, let's say, one of my favorite magicians is David Blaine. And he does these fantastic tricks. He made the Statue of Liberty disappear. He walked through the Wall of China. He flew around like a sports arena, a beautiful illusion. Now, I could say, well, I think the Statue of Liberty one was done by a rotating platform. I think the flying one was done by, invisible wires, and they must have had some other mechanisms. And, other illusions were done with mirrors. And I could list all the assumptions I need, and it could be a long list. Alternatively, I could say, no.
Magic.
It's just magic.
Okay.
That's one assumption. Now, which do you think is simpler?
Yeah, arguably the magic one is a simple explanation.
No, it's not, because it's the number of.
But that's what I'm saying. I assumed you're going to say it's not helpful because it's the plausibility.
It's not even simpler because we're not judging simplicity by number of.
Well, it technically is simpler because there's less there. In the sense of parsimony, there are less assumptions, so it is simpler. But it being simpler here doesn't mean that it provides for that it has explanatory power or explanatory scope, fit with the data, empirical precedent, or any of the other theoretical virtues one might have when considering a theory. And that just goes back to what I said earlier when I said simplicity isn't the be all end all of determining the success or the plausibility of a model.
Of assumptions, you have to weight them by how plausible they are.
Exactly.
So if you have a whole bunch of assumptions, but each one has a higher degree of plausibility, then actually they don't come up to very much, right? So inflationary cosmology, if you ask most cosmologists, is pretty damn plausible, right? Same with string theory in the world of quantum gravity. So whereas God is an immaterial mind that can change the constants of nature. Where's the evidence that there's an immaterial mind that can change the constants of nature?
Really helpfully brings us into land on
I'm not
this
questioning the plausibility
question.
of those theories, although many physicists do. I'm questioning the efficacy of those theories as ultimate explanations for fine-tuning, which is a completely different matter. And notice that Phil did not say that these alternative versions of inflation don't require fine-tuning to produce new universes. And all the models that all the cosmological models that purport to explain the proliferation of new universes do require prior fine-tuning. And that's the unexplained thing that theism explains, that the models themselves can't explain, because that's a brute fact of the models themselves.
Okay. Just respond, and we will start to bring this into land now, on this fundamental question, which we've sort of circled around at various points across the past 2 hours, which is Phil's ultimate sense that not only does he feel there are other models, you don't have to go to a beginning, you don't have to necessarily see fine-tuning as fine-tuned, but he also simply lands on the fact that God is not a good explanation in and of itself. God doesn't give you a testable hypothesis. God doesn't give you, and fundamentally, I think that's probably in the end why a lot of people on his surveys sort of relegate intelligent design, because it doesn't feel like a plausible sort of hypothesis that raises to the level of a scientific one.
Yeah, it just makes a bunch of assumptions. You have to assume a variety of things about the intentions and the desires of God. Why would there be a God that wants to fine tune the universe? Like, it just, and then you say, oh well, because he wants to have a relationship with human. Yeah, but why does he want that? What motivates God's intentions, his goals? What serves as his motivations there? And I think that there's going to be so many assumptions made that the God hypothesis just is not going to be simpler, and I think it's going to be very difficult for it to sort of, it's going to be difficult for it to do any explaining, because it's going to be hard to find the mechanisms or the states of affairs or what have you in virtue of which it does any explaining.
And so on.
But Phil said something very important. He didn't use the term background knowledge, but he said we have to have hypotheses that are consistent with the things we. So it's not just the multiplication of hypotheses that might make something parsimonious. It's the multiplication of hypotheses that are not consistent with our background knowledge. Okay, one of the most important pieces of background knowledge that we have is our knowledge of what agents do that no thing else does, and one of the things that agents do is they generate functional information.
But in our background knowledge of that, all of the agents we know of are physical. And anybody claiming any different doesn't really have, they just don't have much of a leg to stand on.
They also generate finely tuned systems.
Also, all of the agents that we know of act thoroughly within the constraints of the natural world, utilizing natural means, mechanisms, and forces to do whatever it is that they're intending on doing.
And so the hypothesis of a pre-existing mind is not only simpler in the sense that it doesn't multiply theoretical entities, it's also simpler in the sense that it posits an entity which is known to have the kind of powers that are needed to explain the effect in question. And I think
my question there would just be, what powers are those? And how does the result of these powers manifest in the world? What is the mechanism there?
This is where I think the presumption among many scientists that they must limit themselves to materialistic explanation, which has been deeply embedded in the community over the last 150 years, actually which has been among many scientists that they must limit themselves to materialistic explanation, which has been deeply embedded in the community over the last 150 years.
Again, it's not a limitation. It's just fundamentally what science is. Science is an empirical endeavor. God is not an empirical entity. If you want to argue there is some connection between God and the empirical, then it is on you to explain what that connection is, what it looks like, and how it works, and how we might be able to know about this.
Actually blinds people to what's going on around us all the time, that minds have unique causal powers that brute matter doesn't have. And what I see in the cosmological discussion, broad strokes, is that whether we're talking about the origin of the universe or even about the fine-tuning, invariably people recognize something separate from these phenomena are necessary to explain them. But when the explanations are confined to materialistic processes, fields, forces, they might do a nice job of suggesting an entity outside of the thing that needs to be explained. But because our universe has very specific features that, yes, could be otherwise, that specificity requires mind-like properties as a condition of explanation. And so I think that the naturalist has both a something from nothing problem when we're talking about the universe, but also a no free lunch problem, in that fine-tuning or information density, these are things we know from experience come from minds. And when we find them in the universe or in life,
that we also know from experience that the kinds of minds that those things come from are, as far as we can tell, physical and interact through physical means that are constrained by the natural world. William Lane Craig does the same thing here. Appeals sort of to this intuition. Effects have causes. So if the universe is an effect, then it had to have had a cause. Yeah, but it's not just that we intuitively experience that effects have causes, that being does not come from non-being. It's that when there are effects that are physical, the causes are also physical. So you can't appeal to the intuition in one sense, but not appeal to it in the full sense of that picture there, and think you're going to get away with it. That's not how that works.
In systems that we know we did not generate, it is a logical and natural inference based on our background knowledge of the unique properties that agents have to infer agency was at work.
Also, when we infer that something is designed, it doesn't really have anything to do with the properties of the thing that's being claimed to be designed. If you stumbled across a wristwatch on the beach, you would know that it's designed, not because it's out of place, not because it tells the time, not because it has a leather band, but because you have the prior knowledge that watches are designed things. And it's not just that you know that it's designed, you know who designed it. A human, because you know that humans design watches. So if we're going to talk about priors here, when we infer that things are designed, that's almost strictly off of our priors about what is and isn't designed. We've never seen a universe get designed. So we don't really have any meaningful priors with which we can say that the universe being designed by some intelligence is the most plausible explanation, at least if you're trying to appeal to our priors about things.
Work.
Okay, this kind of shifts us into the more metaphysical question of the nature of the explanation. And yeah, Steve says in life we always are assuming that a mind generates, complexity and effects and things. Why shouldn't we?
Anybody that has an entry-level undergraduate education in statistical mechanics knows that you can get complexity via thermodynamics. That's not a remotely controversial thing.
Apply the same logic to the complexity of the universe that we find ourselves in and the fact that it is here in the first place. I mean, without going back over some of the physical explanations we've already spent time debating, like what's your response to the, this I suppose more simple idea that a mind is a plausible way of understanding where all this came from?
Right. Okay. So minds, I don't think, are the only way to get complexity. So I think that's just false. You can get complexity in the natural world, but let's just agree that it is, right?
Okay.
For the sake of argument, they always come from physical minds, right? The information in the mind has to be stored somewhere, and this is stored physically. But that's not what Stephen's suggesting. He's suggesting an immaterial mind, and that doesn't comport with our experience. So minds that we know that can do physics, right? They have physical bodies. Even if you believe in dualism, like, let's not deny dualism, but when they do their design work, they're attached to bodies. So even if you think they're immaterial minds, what our experience is, they always are attached to bodies when they do their design work. They always need an energy source. They're always localized in space, right? And in fact, when we look at the conditions of the early universe, the hot Big Bang, it doesn't look like any mind that we know of could exist there. So there's only two explanations. Either you say minds couldn't exist there, so the explanation that we're looking for is not mind, or you have to say it's some very, very different type of mind to anything that we know. But then you're not appealing to, the everyday world that we know. I'm appealing to what we know.
That's really helpful, right? And it's concise.
Now, I think there's a potential. I just want to address one or 2 points, and then I want to get to a big contradiction. He said, theism, I asked for the predictions. What are the predictions of theism? He said fine-tuning was a prediction. I don't think that's right. First off, as a matter of history, I don't think theologians, maybe you'll correct me if I'm wrong here, I don't know if theologians saying we're going to find out that the cosmological constant was fine-tuned, right? I mean, I can imagine, I don't think that is a prediction of theism. And in fact, I can imagine we found the opposite. Suppose we find the opposite, that the constant nature could take on any value at all, right? I can imagine the theist saying, wow, that's incredible, isn't it? Because God, surely he loves life. So he would set the probability of life to be really
So
high.
you're just moving the goalposts depending on
It's a
the whatever
Texas
the
sharpshooter fallacy.
Okay.
You're seeing where the bullet landed, and you're drawing a bullseye around it, and you're saying, aha, that's what God would have wanted. And if you've got the opposite, and in fact, there are cases that's opposite, right? In fact, the so-called fine-tuning of the entropy, now that is fine-tuned in the sense that if you just selected it randomly, it's fine-tuned, but it's not fine-tuned for life. You could have the entropy enormously, enormously higher, and life would still exist. Bet you the theists are going to say, well, that's evidence against God. We were predicting that it should have this tiny narrow range, but it doesn't. No one's going to say that. Now, I think there's a sort of possibly a contradiction, at least a tension in the fine-tuning argument here, with this appeal to an immaterial mind. Because, let me put it in the form of a dilemma, all right? A, minds can exist without brains. If that's true, right, then the fine-tuning doesn't matter, does it? Like, who cares what the value of the cosmological constant is? That just means you couldn't have a material mind. But hey, minds can exist without matter. So
this is a point that gets brought up, and I think it actually is a meaningful objection to the fine-tuning argument. If you're granting that immaterial minds can exist, wouldn't it have just been simpler to create immaterial minds? Why did God need to create a universe and fine-tune its values for specifically physical natural life to exist in specifically the way that we observe it existing? Why did he need to do all that? Why not? If we don't need physicality for our minds, why all this physical fine-tuning? It's just, I wouldn't use the word contradiction here, but I do think it is an inconsistency. I think it's a contention in the view, much like the one I alluded to earlier, where they want to argue that the universe was finely tuned for life, but couldn't produce life on its own. God had to fine-tune the universe for life and then put life in the fine-tuned universe for it. And that this is another such contention. Immaterial minds can exist, and then God had to fine-tune the physical world for physical minds that are also, I guess, actually immaterial. It seems like this God is just not being very efficient with what he's doing. I don't know if you would call that intelligent design or not.
Minds can still exist. Okay. So it seems like fine-tuning, if you take that option, minds can exist without matter, then it seems like the fine-tuning doesn't matter at all.
It's irrelevant to the question
God can make electrons have mental lives. I mean, often like someone like a theologian like Richard Swinburne will say, what's important is that it's the mental property, the moral property. But hey, theism believes in spirits that rebelled against God, like the devil or his minions, right? So it doesn't follow that if you take this view, minds don't have to be material, then it seems like fine-tuning doesn't matter. Now, the alternative is say, okay, minds have to be material. You have to have material bodies to have moral worth, all right? But if that's true, a lot of Christian theology is wrong, right?
Okay.
Because...
Well, let's see how Steve responds to
okay,
that.
and then I've got one more argument I want to push.
Okay,
so
that
we may be getting to the limits of a discussion like this, because there's so many different things that are being thrown out.
I accept you're not going to be able to respond to everything that Phil's just raised.
I'd be happy to respond. There's a couple things. Okay, first of all, there's a great deal of literature in the philosophy of science about the testability of hypotheses, whether they be metaphysical hypotheses or scientific hypotheses. And it turns out that prediction is a special case of empirical expectation. So I've often used the Dawkins quote I shared before because I really like it. He was here yesterday. I didn't get to talk to him, but he says that the universe we observe has precisely the properties that we should expect. Okay, that we can often test theories not only by what they predict, but also by what they explain. And if if a theory has explanatory power that another theory lacks, that counts in its favor as much as a prediction can count in its favor. So no, it's probably not the case that theologians in advance predicted the fine-tuning, but fine-tuning is the kind of thing you would expect from the activity of a mind, where it's not the kind of thing that you would expect from brute matter. Second,
well, if the fine-tuning is supposed to be such that life like us can arise in the universe, then I think another expectation of that would be that we would expect life to arise naturally. But you don't believe that. Also, I wouldn't expect this God to create a universe where the life that he wants to be in it can't survive even on most of the planet that it's put the life on, let alone the entirety of the universe. I mean, I could sit here for the next 5 hours and read off all the 9s that come after 99 point in terms of the percentage of the universe that life as we fundamentally understand it cannot survive in. That doesn't seem like something that there being mass extinctions, there being all this moral atrocity. There's a variety of things that would not be expected about our world, at least under a classically theistic view. And I think that's important. So you can appeal to things like fine tuning, but I can also appeal to things like evil.
As to the immateriality of the mind, there's a principle in all historical scientific research called the vera causa principle. It also works in physics as well. It's the idea that we should explain things by reference to causes that we know are in operation, or by reference to causes that have relevantly similar properties to those that we know are in operation. For example, Darwin used natural selection to explain the variation and the generation of new biological form by an analogy to what human breeders could do. So he extended known experience of cause and effect by saying that my mechanism of natural selection is relevantly similar. And so that allows me to extrapolate, to explain something I haven't, to explain something that I've never seen produced in nature, but because I've seen something relevantly similar, this is a reasonable postulate. It's a completely reasonable postulate to say, if we're talking about the origin of the fine-tuning of the universe itself, and if we know that fine-tuning is always produced by a mind, that a mind was at work. What kind of mind? No, not a terrestrial mind, not a mind that's embodied in a physical substrate, but perhaps a mind that is transcendent in the sense that Judeo-Christian theology affirms of God. So that is again an appropriate extrapolation from a causal power that we know from experience.
But again, that causal power from experience, as Phil has already outlined, is thoroughly rooted in the physical world. We are constrained by natural laws. We have, physical arms and legs, and I mean, there's nothing about that can be demonstrated to any sufficient degree to be something that isn't a part of the physical world. So if we're going to base that on experience, then that has to be relevant to that analysis.
And that type of move is made in explanation by materialists and theists alike. There are deep questions about the nature of mind and the way in which different models of mind might relate to the whole program of intelligent design. I've written on that. I am a mind-body dualist. I know that Phil went hammer and tongs recently with Alex O'Connor over this very question. Fair enough.
Oh, no, that was about panpsychism.
That was panpsychism.
That's a different issue.
No,
that's
I understand, but he's not a strict. Okay. He doesn't hold an epiphenomenal view or emergent mind. And so, I mean, these are really deep questions in the philosophy of mind. And I think we're going to.
Yeah, that would take us into a whole different realm.
I have written on this. I think
most philosophers of mind are physicalists.
Our view is completely coherent, and I think the fine-tuning argument, because it's based on our knowledge of cause and effect and a relevant extrapolation from that knowledge.
I would argue, and I think that there would be a lot of people within physics that would agree with me, that causality is probably not a fundamental feature of the world. There are things that occur without proper causes in the sense of sufficient conditions. And by sufficient conditions, I just mean the conditions that which, if present, necessitate the occurrence of their effect. If you have water and if it is 0 degrees Celsius, the water will freeze. So, I mean, that's sort of how under that analysis, I would say that there are effects. I wouldn't really say effects. I would say events that occur without proper causes. Tunneling is one of them. Radioactive decay, as well as numerous other kinds of decay events that occur with particles on the standard model. A photon might decay into an electron-positron pair, which annihilate back into a photon, and it will do so stochastically. There isn't anything that determines that this particular photon at this particular time and in this particular place is going to do this particular thing. It just happens because it can. There's maybe necessary conditions for its occurrence, but there are no sufficient conditions for its occurrence. And I think when we talk about causes, most people are referring to sufficient conditions and not strictly necessary conditions.
I think it makes perfect sense to say that the fine-tuning that we see at the foundation of the universe that's necessary to life was produced by a mind that transcends the universe.
Okay, I can see you're scribbling some responses, but I'm aware we've been going for getting on for 3 hours now. So
very quick.
You may happily have the last word.
Thank
If
you.
it's the last word.
And then it won't be the
Stephen. Thank
entire
you.
last
I
word, because
appreciate
we'll have
Okay,
one more
thank you.
attempt at kind of seeing where we got
I just
to.
realized I didn't eat very much at lunch, and I'm
There's snacks outside.
I do believe in certain material things. Like,
okay. So first off, we appeal to causes in operation today to infer the past. Yes, if we think those causes were present in the past. So for example, if I look at the extinction of the dodo, oh yeah, that was hunted to extinction. Humans are the cause. Same with many other species of animals. Humans did it. But if I want to look at the extinction of the dinosaurs, I'm not going to appeal to humans because humans weren't around.
Okay.
So similarly,
obviously.
right. So similarly, I don't think minds can be around in the early universe, because the very reasons that you think life couldn't be around is the very reasons that I think minds couldn't be around. So basically, I'm going to throw the fine-tuning back in your face, basically. Now, can God explain it? Well, God can do anything. So yes, he can explain it, but at a cost of, he can do anything. To me, now this is probably where the difference is. He thinks that's low cost.
Yeah, God has an immense amount of explanatory scope, and that explanatory scope is what can be explained by it, and that God could explain pretty much anything that you wanted to use him to explain. And I think in virtue of that, God has very little explanatory power. Again, for the reasons relating to me and what I explained earlier about contrastive explanations and their importance to understanding the world.
I think that's maximum cost. So yes, you can have it explain stuff, but the cost is too high. So I just don't buy this. All right. Now, you don't just get an explanation for the fine tuning by positing a mind. You have to have a mind with intentions. You have to do something called divine psychology, right? You have to say, well, God is good, and so God would fine tune the constants. If you don't think those are true, then this argument's not going to work. And I think we've got really good reasons to think it's not true, because I think that the God of the Bible is not good. He commands genocide. He commands slaughtering of animals.
That's opening up a whole new can of worms.
But this is what these arguments relate to each other, because if you can predict what a good God would do, then basically you shouldn't observe a world full of suffering. So either you say, I can't predict what God would do, in which case take the fine-tuning argument away. And indeed, there have been Christians who basically advocate something called skeptical theism, that says we're going to explain the problem of evil by saying we don't know what a world God would actually make. You're not epistemically justified in predicting the world that would come about by a good God. And they say, these are Christian philosophers, Hudson's a good example, we shouldn't be using the fine-tuning argument. So I know I'm not going to convince every Christian here, but they should be aware that if they're using the skeptical theism defense for fine-tuning, then they're in trouble. Okay. Now, the other part, so I think there's good evidence then against this mind explanation for fine-tuning, because it requires God to be good, and the evidence is against that. I don't think we have strong evidence against the multiverse. We don't have strong evidence against the necessary hypothesis. We don't have strong evidence against a black hole one, but we do have good evidence against the God one, because it requires, at least the way it's normally formulated, God to be good. And then the very last thing I'll say is it assumes that it's a good thing to create a physical universe. But there were Christians who thought actually it was a bad thing to make the physical universe, because there were these guys called the Gnostics, and they thought the creation of the physical universe was done by an evil demiurge. Okay, and so that challenges the notion that it's a good thing to make a physical universe. They thought we should be spirits. We shouldn't expect a universe with life.
This takes us into interesting theological territory, scriptural territory, all kinds of territory that we're sadly out of time to be able to explore today. So who knows, perhaps we can do another 2 to 3 hour kind of debate on these issues. But we will leave it there. All I will ask is just, well, first of all, I say thank you both.
Alrighty, I'm going to stop the video there. They just kind of do, ooh, I don't like this big. Let's go back to this. Yeah, that's a little better. Again, I think it's absolutely phenomenal discussion. I think it's very, very respectful. I think a lot was touched on. I think Phil did, again, an exceptional job with the points that he made. And, the the word might sound strong, but I don't mean it that way. The level of aggression that he showed in the discussion, I really think he did rigorous atheism a lot of justice in that discussion with Stephen. Like I said, I listened to it before I did these 2 streams. I thought it was good. I've enjoyed listening to it again. Go check it out without all of my interruptions if you want to. I think it is a discussion worth listening to. I think there is a lot of information that can be gleaned from that discussion, regardless of which side of the aisle you're on, in terms of what these arguments are, how they're defended, what the objections to them are, and how we can have meaningful and even passionate discussions about complex issues without having to resort to like a bunch of fuckery. Because I think that was a very somewhat passionate, just a little bit at times, but nevertheless a very, very respectful discussion that Phil and Stephen had. And those are the kinds of discussions I like talking about. With that, I am going to end the stream. I hope you guys enjoy the rest of your wonderful Tuesday evening, and thank you for hanging out with me for this part 2.